The first time I realized my family had already decided my future without me was over a Christmas dinner I wasn't supposed to attend. I know how that sounds. Dramatic, like I'm exaggerating for effect. But I'm not. I was 29 years old, sitting at the far end of my parents' dining table, watching my own life get discussed in the third person while I passed the cranberry sauce. "What do you think we should do about Claire?" my mother asked, not looking at me. She said my name the way people say the weather. Neutral. Detached. Already settled. My father leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his stomach, the posture he used when he believed he was being reasonable. "We'll talk about it after the holidays," he said. "No need to upset anyone right now." Anyone except me, apparently. My younger sister, Megan, caught my eye for half a second. She smiled, small and tight, then looked down at her plate. That was her specialty, acknowledging discomfort without intervening. She'd perfected it over the years. I remember thinking very clearly that I had missed something. A meeting, a conversation, a decision point. Because whatever it was already in motion. At the time, I still believed families talked things through. I still believed love meant inclusion. That belief didn't survive the winter. 15 minutes earlier, my mother had hugged Megan a little too long and pressed an envelope into her hand. Megan had slipped it into her sweater pocket without comment. No one explained. No one needed to. I recognized the weight and shape immediately. Legal documents. I'd been working in my parents' family business since I was 22. Not because I had to. Because they asked me to. Because my father said, "You're steady, Claire. You see details other people miss." I took that as praise back then. I didn't yet understand how often that sentence precedes exploitation. The company was small, but valuable. A regional logistics firm my grandfather had started decades ago, now expanded enough to own warehouses in 3 states. On paper, my father was CEO. In practice, I ran operations, vendor contracts, compliance, scheduling, the unglamorous parts that kept everything functioning. Megan handled marketing, public-facing, smiling, travel, conferences. She was good at it. She was also forgiven for everything. I handled problems. I was expected to absorb them quietly. That Christmas, my brother Luke arrived late, as usual, reeking faintly of beer and entitlement. My mother kissed his cheek and told him not to worry about carving the turkey. "You've had a long year," she said. I had worked 80-hour weeks since October. No one asked about my year. Dinner passed in polite fragments. Politics avoided. Old stories recycled. My father made a joke about how lucky he was to have kids who understood sacrifice. He glanced at Megan when he said it, not me. Then the conversation turned to the future. "We're not getting any younger," my mother said, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "It's time to think about stability." "That's why the new structure makes sense," my father replied. I set my fork down, slowly. "What structure?" They all froze, for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see it. The shared look, the calculation. "Oh," my mother said, "we didn't tell you yet." That sentence changed everything. They explained it the way people explain something inevitable, as if the decision had been handed down by gravity, not made by choice. Megan would gradually step into a senior leadership role. Luke would be supported while he figured out his next move. My parents would retain ownership, of course, but the succession plan would reflect family harmony. "And where do I fit?" I asked. My father smiled, the one that used to reassure me. "You're invaluable where you are, Claire." I didn't miss the phrasing. Not "you'll lead," not "we're counting on you." Invaluable where you are, like a fixture, like wiring inside the walls. I waited for more, for clarification, for acknowledgement that I had effectively been running the company for years. It didn't come. You'll continue overseeing operations, my mother said gently. You're so good at it. And honestly, you don't really like the spotlight anyway. That was when I felt it. Not anger, not sadness, something colder. A realization settling into place. They weren't misunderstanding me. They were managing me. The conversation moved on. Luke asked about bonuses. Megan asked about office renovations. My father poured more wine. I sat there, my chest tight, hearing my own contributions reframed as personality traits that justified excluding me. After dessert, my mother asked me to help clear the table. She always did. It was our unspoken routine. In the kitchen, with the faucet running, she finally looked at me. You're quiet, she said. I'm thinking, I replied. She touched my arm. Don't take this personally. That sentence is never followed by something impersonal. It's just, she continued, Megan needs confidence. Luke needs support. You're strong. You'll be fine. Strong, the word people use when they plan to take from you. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why my strength disqualified me from security. I went home that night and lay awake until morning, replaying every moment I'd been told I was essential while being quietly excluded from decisions that shaped my own life. 2 weeks later, I found out my name wasn't on the draft of the updated will. Not accidentally, not temporarily, deliberately. I discovered it the way people often discover betrayal now. By mistake. A document left open on my father's desk while I dropped off revised shipping reports. I wasn't snooping. I didn't need to. The heading was clear. Estate planning summary. Megan, Luke, charitable trusts, business interests. My name appeared once, in a footnote, as an employee. That was the moment something in me went silent. I didn't confront them, not then. I closed the folder exactly the way I found it. I finished my work. I answered emails. I attended meetings. But inside, I stopped asking to be chosen. I started watching instead. And what I saw, once I allowed myself to see it, was a pattern that had been there my entire life. The forgotten birthdays. The promotions that never came. The way my competence made everyone comfortable enough to overlook my needs. Love in my family had always come with conditions. I just hadn't understood the cost until now. By the time spring arrived, I was already planning my exit. I just didn't know yet how much they would try to take from me before I left, or how far they would push before I stopped being quiet. That part came later, much later. And when it did, none of us would be able to pretend this was just a misunderstanding anymore. By March, I understood something I hadn't let myself name before. I wasn't just excluded from my family's future. I was being slowly erased from it. The realization didn't arrive with drama. No shouting, no confrontation. It came quietly, in small, administrative shifts that would have seemed harmless to anyone not paying attention. My access to financial reports was changed temporarily. Vendor meetings I'd always led were rescheduled without my knowledge. Decisions I used to make were now framed as suggestions that needed approval. Each change came with a smile. Each one carried the same message. You're still useful, but no longer trusted. I watched it happen the way you watch a tide come in. Too gradual to stop, too deliberate to deny. One Tuesday morning, I arrived early, as usual. The warehouse lights hummed overhead as forklifts moved in practiced patterns. This was my domain, the part of the business that actually breathed. I opened my laptop and tried to log into the contract management system. Access denied. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then tried again. Same result. I walked down the hall to my father's office. His door was open. He was already on a call, laughing softly. I waited. He waved me in without muting. When he finally ended the call, He leaned back. What's up? I can't access the contracts database. He frowned, the concerned executive expression he'd perfected. Oh, yes. We centralized permissions. When I asked? Last week. Just streamlining. And no one thought to tell me, he shrugged. Megan's handling vendor relations now. You don't really need full access. There it was again. That phrasing. You don't really need. I nodded. Okay. He looked relieved. Not because the issue was resolved, but because I hadn't pushed back. You're adaptable, he said. That's always been your strength. I left his office without another word. At my desk, I sat very still. Around me, the company moved as if nothing had changed. Phones rang. Trucks arrived. Employees laughed about weekend plans. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time since joining the business, I was no longer essential by design. They were rewriting my role while keeping my workload intact. A quiet demotion without the dignity of acknowledgement. That afternoon, Megan stopped by my desk at the sisig. She leaned against the partition, arms crossed, casual. Dad says you had questions about access. I had a problem, I said. It was resolved. She smiled. Good. This new structure will be better for everyone. For who, I asked. She hesitated, then recovered. For the family. That word again. Family. Always used like a shield. Megan, I said evenly. When were you planning to tell me I was being sidelined? Her expression tightened. You're not sidelined. Then what am I? She looked away. You're stable. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said, do you know I'm not in the will? Her head snapped back toward me. That's not true. I held her gaze. I saw the draft. Silence settled. Silence settled between us, heavy and revealing. She exhaled slowly. It's complicated. It's not, I replied. It's deliberate. She lowered her voice. Mom and Dad think it's best this way. You don't need ownership to feel secure. You have skills. You'll always land on your feet. There it was. The justification. Because I was capable, I was expendable. Because I didn't fall apart. I didn't need protection. I nodded once. Thank you for being honest. She reached out, then stopped herself. Claire, don't make this a fight. I looked up at her. I'm not. That seemed to confuse her more than anger would have. After she left, I opened a new document on my computer. Not a resignation letter. Not a complaint. A timeline. Dates. Conversations. Changes in access. Shifts in responsibility. Every email where decisions were made without me. Every meeting I was removed from. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I just knew I needed a record. That night, I went home and opened a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents my grandmother had given me shortly before she died. Deeds, old partnership agreements, notes in her careful handwriting. At the time, I hadn't understood why she insisted I keep them. Now I began to see patterns. My grandmother had been many things, but naive wasn't one of them. She'd built parts of the business alongside my grandfather that no one ever mentioned. She'd been written out quietly, too. History, it seemed, didn't repeat itself loudly in my family. It whispered. The next escalation came at a family birthday dinner. Luke's, of course. A restaurant too loud for serious conversation, perfect for avoiding accountability. My mother raised her glass. To Luke, who's finally figuring out his next chapter. Everyone clapped. No one asked about mine. Halfway through dessert, my father announced, "We've decided Megan will officially represent the company at the regional board meeting next month." I felt it then. The finality. That meeting had always been my responsibility. I'd built those relationships. I'd handled the regulators. I'd absorbed the pressure so my family could remain likable. And Claire, he continued glancing at me, will focus internally. Where she excels. I smiled politely. Inside, something hardened. Later in the parking lot, my mother caught up to me. "You seem distant tonight." "I was listening," I said. She frowned. "We're not pushing you away." "You are," I replied. "You're just doing it quietly." She sighed. Why can't you just trust us? Because trust requires consent, I thought. And I had none. Instead, I said I do trust you. That's why I'm paying attention. She didn't like that answer. Neither did I, not really. But it was honest. By the time I got home, my decision wasn't fully formed, but the direction was clear. If my family wanted control more than connection, then I would stop offering both. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't argue. I would step back, gather my footing, and choose myself. They just didn't know yet that their quiet manipulation had set something in motion they couldn't reverse. And when they realized it, it would already be too late to stop me. I stopped correcting people in April. When vendors emailed Megan instead of me, I didn't forward the messages back with explanations. When meetings appeared on calendars without my name, I didn't ask to be added. When decisions were announced as fates accompli, I nodded and took notes like everyone else. On the surface, nothing changed. Internally, everything did. What my family didn't understand was that my silence wasn't compliance. It was preparation. The company had always depended on routines I'd built quietly over years. Not glamorous systems, but fragile ones. Vendor relationships held together by trust. Compliance schedules memorized rather than documented. Contingencies that lived mostly in my head because no one ever made time to formalize them. I had tried. God, I had tried. But once I stopped reminding them, the cracks began to show. It started small. A missed renewal deadline with a freight partner in Indiana. Nothing catastrophic, just a penalty fee. Megan waved it off in a meeting. Growing pains, she said, smiling. Then a delayed compliance filing in Ohio. A warning notice. Luke joked about bureaucracy over drinks. I watched. I said nothing. At home, my personal life was unraveling more quietly. My boyfriend of 3 years, Daniel, noticed before anyone else. You're different, he said one night as we ate takeout on the couch. Not sad, just elsewhere. I'm paying attention, I replied. To what? To how much space I've been giving away. He studied me. Is this about your family? It's about control, I said, and how easily it hides behind concern. He didn't argue. He never did. That was part of the problem. 2 days later, my mother called. Not about work, about Easter. We're hosting this year, she said. Megan and Luke will be there early to help. And me, I asked. Well, she hesitated. You're always so busy. Come when you can. I almost laughed. I wasn't busy anymore. Not in the way I used to be. That Sunday, I arrived on time anyway. They were already seated when I walked in. No place setting for me. Oh, my mother said, startled. We didn't know you'd be here so early. I said I would, I replied. She added a chair, flustered. Megan avoided my eyes. Luke didn't notice at all. As we ate, conversation flowed around me. Plans, trips, business expansions, all discussed freely now that I wasn't considered part of the decision-making circle. At one point, my father said, We're restructuring operations oversight next quarter. I looked up. Oh, he nodded. We're bringing in an external consultant. Fresh perspective. I waited. And my role, you'll support, he said. As needed. There it was. The formal downgrade. Spoken aloud for the first time. Something in my chest loosened. Not pain, relief. Because now it was undeniable. After lunch, my mother pulled me aside. You're being very calm, she said. I am, I replied. That worries me. It shouldn't, I said gently. I'm just adjusting. She searched my face, as if looking for something familiar. You're not angry. No, that's worse, she murmured. She was right. Anger could be managed. Silence could not. The following week, the consultant arrived. A man named Robert, with expensive shoes, in a habit of repeating things I'd said years ago, as if they were revelations. In meetings, he asked questions I could answer in seconds. I let others speak instead. When he recommended changes that would break existing workflows, I said nothing. It took 12 days for the first serious failure. A shipping backlog cascaded across 2 warehouses. Clients called, drivers waited, penalties accrued by the hour. My father called me into his office. His tone was different now, sharper. "Why wasn't this flagged?" he demanded. "It was," I said, "in February." He frowned. "Then why wasn't it fixed?" "Because the fix required authority I no longer have." Silence. Robert shifted uncomfortably. Megan stared at the table. My father exhaled. "Claire, you need to be proactive." I met his eyes. I was. For years. That was the first time I'd said it aloud. The room felt smaller after that. That evening, I went home and opened my grandmother's box again. This time, I read every note. One envelope contained a letter addressed to me. No date, no explanation. She'd written, "Claire, if you're reading this, it means you've learned the cost of being the reliable one." My throat tightened. She detailed how she'd been pushed out of decision-making while still expected to hold everything together. How she trusted that being indispensable would protect her. It didn't. At the end, she wrote, "Control disguised as care is still control." I sat there for a long time, the weight of generational silence pressing in. The next escalation came unexpectedly. A lawyer's letter arrived at my apartment, forwarded from my parents' address. Inside was a formal notice outlining changes to my employment agreement. Reduced authority, revised compensation structure, non-compete clause expanded. They were tightening the net. I called my father immediately. "This is a demotion," I said. "It's an adjustment," he replied. "It's punishment for not fitting the narrative." He bristled. "You're overreacting." "I'm reacting accurately," I said, "and I need time to review this." "With who?" he asked sharply. That question told me everything. "With a lawyer," I replied. He went quiet, then colder. "Is that necessary?" "Yes." "You're turning this into something ugly," he said. I almost smiled. "No," I thought. "You did that. I'm just finally seeing it clearly." That night, I booked a consultation with an employment and estate attorney. Not to threaten, not to retaliate, to understand my options. Because once you realize love has been used as leverage, the only responsible thing to do is reclaim your agency. I wasn't planning revenge. Not yet. I was planning survival. And somewhere between the paperwork, the silence, and the letter my grandmother's left behind, I understood something that would change the rest of my life. They had mistaken my loyalty for weakness, and they were about to learn the difference. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. Not unpleasant, just serious. Her name was Judith Hale, mid-50s, calm eyes, the kind of woman who listened without interrupting and took notes only after you finished speaking, not while you were still deciding what to say. That alone made me trust her more than anyone had in months. I laid everything out. The business, my role, the gradual removal of authority, the will, the revised employment agreement, the non-compete clause that would effectively trap me. She didn't react emotionally. She never said, "That's terrible," or "I'm sorry." She simply nodded occasionally, asking for dates, documents, clarification. When I finished, she folded her hands. "Your family," she said carefully, "has created a structure where you bear operational responsibility without corresponding power or protection." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "That's exactly it," she continued. "Legally, this isn't unusual. Ethically, it's questionable. Strategically, it's dangerous." "For who?" I asked. "For them," she replied. "But more importantly, for you." She slid the employment agreement toward her and tapped the non-compete clause. "This section is overly broad," she said. "It's enforceable only if they can demonstrate fair consideration. Given the compensation reduction and authority removal, that's debatable." "What about the will?" I asked. She paused. "Estate planning is more complex. Parents can exclude adult children. But if you've been induced to remain employed, under implied future interest. There may be grounds to challenge intent. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I don't want to sue my parents, I said. Judith nodded. Most people don't. They just want leverage. Yes, I said. That. She leaned back. Then, your priority is documentation and timing. You don't react emotionally. You prepare. I almost smiled. That sounded familiar. Over the next 2 weeks, I did exactly that. I gathered emails, employment contracts, performance reviews that praised my leadership while stripping my authority, messages where my parents explicitly relied on my expertise while excluding me from decisions. At work, I remained composed, professional, helpful when asked. But I stopped anticipating problems. The consultant's recommendations began to collide with reality. A new routing software was implemented without proper testing. Deliveries were delayed. Clients complained. My father's tone shifted again. Less certainty, more irritation. You need to be more engaged, he said one afternoon. I'm following the structure you put in place, I replied, supporting as needed. He didn't like hearing his own words reflected back at him. At home, Daniel noticed the change more clearly now. You're not trying to fix everything, he said. I'm trying to stop bleeding, I replied. He nodded slowly. Do you think they know what they're doing to you? Yes, I said. They just don't call it that. Easter came and went without much incident. Then Mother's Day arrived. I sent flowers. I did not attend brunch. My mother called that afternoon, voice tight. Are you avoiding us? No, I said. I'm creating space. For what? For clarity. She sighed. You've always been dramatic. That was the moment I stopped hoping she would understand. At work, the real fracture came in late May. A state compliance audit flagged inconsistencies in warehouse reporting. Issues I would have caught immediately before. Issues I had raised concerns about months earlier. The auditors requested documentation. My father called an emergency meeting. Megan was pale. Luke wasn't there. Robert, the consultant, flipped through pages sweating. Why weren't these reconciled? My father demanded. I spoke calmly. Because the reconciliation process was tied to my previous access level. You should have said something, he snapped. I did, I replied, repeatedly. Silence fell. This time, no one contradicted me. After the meeting, Megan cornered me in the hallway. Why are you letting this happen? She asked, voice low. I studied her. I'm not letting anything happen. I'm respecting the boundaries you all set. That's not fair. Neither was rewriting my future. Without telling me, I said. She swallowed. Mom's scared. Of what I asked. Of losing control. That word again. The next day, Judith called. They've moved, she said. What do you mean? Your parents filed the revised employment agreement with their council. They're formalizing your reduced role. I closed my eyes briefly. Okay, Claire, she said gently. This is the moment where people usually react. They argue, they confront, they blow things up. I'm not doing that, I said. I know, she replied. That's why you have options. She outlined them carefully. Resignation with protective clauses. A demand letter challenging the non-compete. A formal request for severance. A preemptive estate inquiry. Each option carried risk. Each carried power. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the documents spread out in front of me. I thought about my childhood, about being praised for being easy, about how often love had been conditional on my compliance. I thought about my grandmother's handwriting, control disguised as care. And then finally, I made my decision. Not to confront them, not to punish them, to remove myself entirely from the structure they used to contain me. The next morning, I requested a meeting with my parents. Not urgent, not emotional, just to discuss next steps. They agreed immediately. Relief, I suspected. They thought this was resolution. They were wrong, because when I walked into that conference room 2 days later, I wasn't there to ask for my place back. I was there to take my exit on my own terms. And they had no idea what I was about to put on the table. The conference room felt smaller than it used to. Same long table, same framed photos on the wall, same view of the parking lot where I'd arrived early, for years coffee in hand, ready to carry what needed carrying. My parents were already seated. Megan sat beside my mother. Luke was absent again. No one mentioned it. My father gestured for me to sit. So he said, forcing warmth into his voice, "You wanted to talk." "Yes," I replied, placing my folder on the table. "I wanted clarity." My mother smiled tightly. "We've been worried about you." I believed her. That didn't make it less dangerous. "I've reviewed the revised employment agreement," I continued. "And I've consulted counsel." The word landed exactly as I intended. My father's posture shifted. "A lawyer." "Yes." Megan looked down. My mother's smile faltered. "That seems extreme," my mother said. "No," I replied calmly. "It's appropriate." I slid a document across the table. Not a resignation, not a complaint, a separation proposal. "This outlines my exit from the company," I said. "Effective in 60 days. My father stared at the paper as if it might explode. "You're quitting?" he asked. "I'm transitioning," I said. "Professionally and personally." My mother's voice trembled. "You can't just leave. You know how much we rely on you." "I do," I said. "That's why this is structured." Judith had helped me craft it carefully. No accusations, no ultimatums, just facts. Severance, commensurate with my years of service. A neutral reference. Immediate release from the non-compete. A consulting window. Optional, compensated. My father read in silence, jaw tightening. "This is very sudden," he said. "It isn't," I replied. "It's been building for years." Megan finally spoke. "Is this because of the will?" I met her gaze. "It's because of everything." My mother reached for my hand. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. "We never meant to hurt you," she said. "I know," I replied. "But intent doesn't erase impact." My father pushed the papers back slightly. "This feels like pressure." "It's a boundary," I said. There it was. The line I'd practiced. The one that changed everything. "You're forcing our hand," he said. "No," I said. "I'm removing mine." Silence stretched. The kind that used to make me anxious. Now it didn't. Finally, my father spoke. "What if we revise the structure again? Restore some authority. Adjust compensation." 2 months ago, that would have been enough. Now, it wasn't. "I don't want to renegotiate my place," I said. "I want to choose it." My mother's eyes filled. "We're family." "Yes," I said softly. "And this is exactly why I can't stay." The meeting ended without resolution. They asked for time. I gave it. At work, rumors spread quickly. I didn't deny or confirm. I continued doing my job, carefully, completely, within the limits they had set. The systems began to strain, not because I sabotaged anything, because the safety nets I'd quietly provided were no longer being maintained. A major client threatened to pull their contract over repeated delays. Megan panicked. Luke finally showed up defensive and unhelpful. My father called me late one night. His voice was tired. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I do," I replied. For what he asked. Some principle. For myself, I said. For the first time. He hung up without saying goodbye. 2 days later, Judith called. They countered, she said. The offer was better. More money. More acknowledgement. Still no ownership. Still no apology. I read it once. Then again. Then I declined. I sent my response through Judith. Brief, professional, final. The next morning, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. She stood in the doorway, clutching her purse like a shield. "I don't recognize you anymore," she said. I met her gaze. "You never really did." That hurt her. I saw it land. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Because being the dependable one nearly erased me," I said. "And I won't let that happen again." She left without another word. My last day at the company came quietly. No announcement, no speech, just a handshake from HR in a cardboard box with my name on it. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter than I had in years, but I wasn't free yet, because leaving a system that trained you to disappear takes time, and because my family wasn't finished trying to pull me back. The real confrontation hadn't happened yet. It was coming, and when it did, it wouldn't be loud. It would be final. The first week after I left the company, my phone was silent. No emergencies, no late-night calls, no panicked messages asking me where something lived or how something worked. That silence was unsettling at first, not because I missed the chaos, but because my nervous system didn't know what to do without it. I slept longer than usual, woke up disoriented. My body was adjusting to a life where I wasn't needed every minute to prevent collapse. On the fourth day, the calls started. Not from work, from family. My mother left a voicemail, careful and brittle. "We should talk." Megan texted, "Please don't do this like this." Luke sent nothing. That was his contribution. I didn't respond. Not out of spite, out of necessity. Judith had warned me. Once you exit, they'll escalate emotionally. Not to resolve, to regain control. She was right. On Friday afternoon, I received an email from my father. Formal, measured, CC'd to their attorney. Subject transition support inquiry. They wanted me back as a consultant. Not on my terms, on theirs. Hourly. Limited scope. Non-compete intact. Emergency availability implied. I forwarded it to Judith without comment. Her reply came 10 minutes later. "They're testing the boundary." I let the test sit unanswered. That weekend, Daniel and I went to the coast. A small rental near the water. No agenda. No reception in some spots. On the second morning, as I watched the tide pull back from the shore, something inside me finally exhaled. I didn't realize how much I was bracing all the time I told him. He nodded. "You don't flinch when your phone buzzes anymore." I smiled faintly. He was right. When we returned, reality followed. A certified letter waited in my mailbox. Inside was a notice alleging breach of loyalty. A suggestion, carefully worded, that my departure had caused operational harm. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. A warning. Judith was calm when I called her. "This is intimidation," she said. "They're laying groundwork." For what? For blame. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter spread open. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I know," she said. "And so do they. But facts don't stop people who feel entitled to your labor." 2 days later, Megan showed up at my door. Her eyes were red. She looked smaller than I remembered. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "I know," I replied. We sat at opposite ends of the couch. "They're drowning," she said quietly. "Things are breaking. Clients are furious. Dad doesn't sleep anymore." I didn't respond. "They need you," she continued. "No," I said. "They need the systems they refused to support." She flinched. "That's not fair." I met her gaze. "It's accurate." She rubbed her hands together. "They think you planned this, that you let things fall apart on purpose." I felt a flicker of anger then. Not sharp, heavy. "I warned them for years," I said. "And I documented everything." "I know," she whispered. "I found your old reports. They were never read." That was the closest thing to an apology I would get. "They want you to come back," she said. "Even temporarily." "I won't," I replied. She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that. "Then they'll make this ugly." "I know," I said. She looked at me, then really looked. "I don't think they ever understood what it cost you to hold everything together." "I don't think they wanted to," I said. She stood to leave, hesitated. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." It didn't fix anything, but it mattered. The escalation came the following week. A client filed a formal complaint with the state. An audit was announced. My name appeared in internal emails I was copied on accidentally. Former colleagues texted questions that weren't really questions. I didn't answer. Judith sent a cease and desist letter. Calm, precise, unemotional. The response was immediate. They wanted a meeting, not a family meeting, a legal one. The night before, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, from the weight of what was about to close. Because once lawyers sit at the table, the illusion of family evaporates, and I had to be ready to let that illusion go. The next morning, I put on a simple black dress and walked into Judith's office. My parents were already there. My father looked older. My mother looked rigid. Their attorney avoided my eyes. No hugs, no small talk, just paper. As we took our seats, I realized something with startling clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my right to choose who I showed up for. And when the meeting began, I knew there would be no going back, because I was done being managed by love that came with conditions. The meeting lasted 2 hours. No raised voices, no dramatic accusations, just language sharpened to cut without bleeding. Their attorney spoke first. He outlined concerns about operational disruption, loss of institutional knowledge, and duty of good faith. My name was repeated, often always in the third person, always carefully detached from who I actually was. Judith listened without interruption. When he finished, she slid a folder across the table. Inside were my emails, dated warnings, requests for staffing, documentation proposals that had been deprioritized, deferred, ignored. She didn't argue. She presented facts. This, she said calmly, is not abandonment. This is withdrawal after sustained overreach. My father shifted in his chair. Their attorney pivoted. Regardless, the company suffered harm after Miss Carter's departure. Judith nodded. Correlation is not causation, especially when the risk was documented and dismissed. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, strategic. Then my mother spoke, not as a client, as a parent. Claire, she said softly, is this really how you want this to end? I looked at her, really looked. I didn't choose this ending, I said. I chose not to disappear quietly. Her eyes filled. We did our best. I know, I replied. That doesn't mean it was enough. My father cleared his throat. What do you want? The question was sharper than it sounded. It wasn't curiosity. It was bargaining. Judith glanced at me. I nodded once. I want formal acknowledgement, I said, that I raised these issues, that my authority was reduced while my responsibilities remained, that my exit was a consequence of that structure. Their attorney frowned. That exposes the company. Yes, I said. That's the point. My father's jaw tightened. You're asking us to admit fault. I'm asking you to tell the truth, I said. For once, silence again. Longer this time. Judith added, in exchange, my client will provide limited transition consulting under her terms. Remote, fixed duration, no non-compete, no emergency availability, clear scope. My father looked at my mother. She nodded faintly. The attorney asked for a break. While they stepped out, Judith leaned toward me. You're holding steady, she said quietly. I'm done being flexible, I replied. When they returned, the tone had shifted. They agreed to the acknowledgement, carefully worded, legally reviewed, but unmistakable. They agreed to the consulting terms. They agreed to release me from the non-compete. They did not apologize. I hadn't expected them to. When it was over, my mother reached for my hand again. This didn't have to be war, she said. It wasn't, I replied. It was a boundary. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully understand the difference. The consulting began the following Monday. 4 weeks, 2 hours a day. Remote. I logged in, delivered exactly what I'd promised, and logged out. No extra effort, no emotional labor, no fixing what wasn't my responsibility. The company stabilized. Not because I saved it, but because they were finally forced to confront the fragility they'd ignored. During that time, something else happened quietly. An email arrived from a former vendor I'd worked with for years. He'd heard I was no longer with the family business. We're launching a new operation, he wrote. Looking for someone who understands logistics from the inside. Thought of you. I didn't respond immediately. Another email followed, then another. Opportunities I'd never seen before. Not because I lacked skill, but because I'd been invisible behind my family's name. One evening, after a long call, Explaining systems to people who were only now paying attention, I closed my laptop and felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, relief, because for the first time, my value was being recognized without being exploited. When the 4 weeks ended, I sent my final report. Clear, complete, detached. My father called once more. "You did good work," he said. "I always did," I replied. He hesitated. "If things had been different." "They weren't," I said gently. We ended the call without resolution. But something had shifted. They no longer spoke as if I would return, and I no longer felt the pull to be needed. The next chapter of my life wasn't going to be about proving anything. It was going to be about choosing where my effort belonged. And I had already started choosing. The consequences of that choice were still unfolding. But for the first time, they were mine. The consulting contract ended on a Thursday. At exactly 4:00 p.m., I logged out of the system for the last time and closed my laptop. No ceremony, no lingering, just a clean, deliberate ending. I expected to feel empty. Instead, I felt alert, like someone who'd been holding their breath for years and had finally remembered how to inhale properly. That night, I slept without dreaming. The next morning, my phone buzzed before sunrise. Not a crisis, an introduction. A woman named Nora Patel, COO of a mid-sized logistics startup expanding across the Southwest. She'd been referred by the same vendor who'd emailed me weeks earlier. "We're not a family business," she said on our first call. "And we don't pretend to be. We pay for expertise. We don't assume loyalty." I smiled at that. We talked for an hour, not about titles or resumes, but about systems failures and how organizations break when accountability gets sentimental. At the end, she said, "If you're interested, we'd like to bring you on as operations director. Full authority, full transparency." I didn't say yes immediately. Not because I wasn't interested, because I'd learned to pause before stepping into new structures. That afternoon, my mother called. Her voice was lighter than it had been in months. "Your father wants to host a small dinner," she said. "Just us. No lawyers." I considered the invitation carefully. "What's the purpose?" I asked. She hesitated. "Closure." I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I'll come, but I won't discuss work." She agreed too quickly. The dinner was polite, controlled, like people afraid of setting off something they didn't understand. My father avoided business entirely. My mother talked about neighbors. Megan asked about Daniel. Halfway through, Luke finally spoke. So he said, smirking faintly, "You got what you wanted." The table went still. I looked at him calmly. "I got what I needed." He scoffed. "Must be nice. Walking away when things get hard." I felt the old reflex stir, the urge to explain, to justify. I let it pass. "I didn't walk away," I said. "I stepped out of something that was hurting me." My father frowned. "This again?" "No," I replied. "This ends tonight." I set my napkin down. "I won't be the subject of jokes or revisionist history. If that continues, I'll leave." Luke laughed, nervously. "Relax." I stood. He stopped laughing. My mother reached for me. "Please don't go." "I will if I need to," I said. "That's the difference now." The rest of the dinner passed without incident. As I drove home, I felt something shift permanently. They could no longer provoke me into shrinking. The following week, I accepted Nora's offer. The new role was different in ways I hadn't expected. People asked questions and waited for the answers. Decisions were documented. Authority matched responsibility. On my third day, a junior manager pushed back on one of my proposals. "Can you explain your reasoning?" she asked. I did. She nodded. "That makes sense. Thanks for walking me through it." No defensiveness. No hierarchy masquerading as respect. I nearly cried in the bathroom afterward. Quietly. Out of relief. Meanwhile, news from my family's company trickled in through old contacts. Turnover. Resignations. Clients still wary. They were functioning. Barely. One evening, Megan called. "I didn't realize how much you did," she said. "Until you weren't there." "I know," I replied. "I don't think I ever said thank you." "You didn't," I said. "But I'm okay with that." She was quiet. "Are we okay?" I considered the question. "We're different," I said. "That might be the best version of okay we can manage." She accepted that. As weeks passed, something unexpected happened. I stopped replaying old conversations in my head. The need to be understood faded. Not because they finally understood me, but because I no longer needed them to. One night, Judith emailed to check in. "You did well," she wrote. "You held the line." I replied simply, "I learned to." At my new job, I was invited into rooms I'd never been in before. Strategy sessions, board briefings, conversations where my presence wasn't questioned. My family noticed the change too. At the next holiday, my seat was set without being asked. I didn't mistake that for growth. I recognized it for what it was. Adjustment. And that was enough. Because the real victory wasn't changing them. It was changing my relationship to them. And that shift had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. The first time I realized my absence had become permanent was at Thanksgiving. Not because of an argument. Not because anyone said something unforgivable. But because no one asked me to fix anything. I arrived at my parents' house 20 minutes late, on purpose. Old habit reversal. For years, I'd arrived early, to help, to smooth, to anticipate. This time, I let myself walk in like a guest. The turkey was already carved. The table was set. The kitchen was loud, in that forced, cheerful way families adopt when they're trying to prove something. My mother hugged me careful, as if testing new boundaries. "Traffic?" "Yes," I said. "Nothing dramatic." She smiled. "Good." That word again. Good. But different now. Less evaluative. Luke was already drinking. Megan stood near the counter, scrolling on her phone. My father sat at the head of the table, looking tired in a way I'd never seen before. Not stressed, diminished. During dinner, conversation stayed safely shallow. Weather, neighbors, a new restaurant downtown. Then my father cleared his throat. "We lost another client last week," he said. No one reacted immediately. "We expected it," Megan finally said. "They're consolidating vendors." My father nodded, but I saw it in his eyes. This wasn't expected. This was erosion. Luke laughed lightly. "Well, that's business." I noticed something then. No one looked at me. Not accusing, not expectant. Just not looking. For the first time, I wasn't the silent solution waiting at the edge of the table. I was irrelevant. And instead of panic, I felt peace. After dinner, my mother asked if I wanted pie. I said yes. She served it herself. "I'm glad you came," she said quietly. "So am I," I replied. And I meant it. Later, as I was leaving, my father walked me to the door. "You seem settled," he said. "I am," I replied. He hesitated. "Your mother worries we pushed you too hard." I met his gaze. "You didn't push. You pulled. For a long time." He absorbed that without argument. "I wouldn't do it the same way again," he said. That wasn't an apology, but it was the closest he was capable of. At work, things accelerated. Nora asked me to lead a restructuring initiative across 3 departments. Not because things were broken, but because she trusted my judgment. During one meeting, a senior manager questioned my authority openly. Before I could respond, Nora stepped in. "Claire has final say on this," she said. Calm, unapologetic. The room adjusted instantly. No debate, no justification. I realized then how much energy I'd spent in the past, earning permission to exist. Now it was assumed. That shift changed everything. A month later, a recruiter reached out. Then another. Then another. My name had begun circulating quietly. Not as someone's daughter. Not as someone's backup. As someone who built resilient systems and didn't burn people out doing it. One email caught my attention. A private equity firm acquiring family-owned businesses. They wanted an operations advisor. someone who understood the emotional blind spots of legacy leadership. I almost laughed when I read it. Almost. Around Christmas, my mother sent a card, handwritten. It said simply, "We're learning." I stared at those two words for a long time. Learning didn't mean changing, but it meant noticing. And sometimes, that was all you got. The final escalation came unexpectedly. In early January, my father suffered a minor stroke. Not devastating, not fatal, but enough to expose what had been carefully avoided. I got the call from Megan. "He's stable," she said quickly. "But things are complicated." I drove to the hospital without hesitation. In the waiting room, Luke paced. Megan cried quietly. My mother stared at the wall. No one asked me what to do. They just looked at me. Old reflexes stirred. I felt the familiar urge to take charge, to organize, to solve. I resisted it. "I'm here," I said. "But I'm not stepping back into old roles." My mother nodded immediately. "We understand." This time I believed her. When my father woke later that evening, he looked at me and said my name like it mattered. "I'm glad you came," he said. "So am I replied again, not because I was needed, because I chose to be there. That distinction mattered more than anything else. As I drove home that night, city lights blurring past, I understood something with clarity. The power shift wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet moment when you realize you can show up without disappearing. And that realization was irreversible, because once you reclaim your right to choose, no one else gets to decide your place again. After my father's stroke, the family moved carefully around me. Not out of respect, out of uncertainty. They no longer knew which version of me they were dealing with. The reliable one who absorbed pressure without complaint, or the one who set limits and meant them. The truth was, I wasn't either anymore. I was something else. Someone who chose when and how to engage. My father recovered quickly, physically at least. But something in the house had changed. The business was no longer discussed as an extension of identity. It was just a company now, fragile, exposed. 2 weeks after he came home, my mother called and asked if I could come by. "Just to talk," she said. I agreed. We sat at the kitchen table where so many decisions had once been made without me. The room smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. Familiar, neutral. "I'm stepping back," my father said, "from day-to-day operations." I nodded. "That makes sense. We're considering selling," my mother added quickly, as if bracing for my reaction. I felt a flicker of surprise, then understanding. "The buyers want clean books and a stable transition," my father continued. "They've asked about your role, historically." There it was. I took a breath. "And what did you say?" "That you're no longer involved," my mother said. "By your choice." Good, I thought. Accurate. "They also asked," my father said carefully, "if you'd be willing to consult during due diligence. Just to answer questions. Not operational." I considered it, not emotionally, practically. "What are the terms?" I asked. My mother looked relieved. "We haven't discussed specifics yet." I would, I said calmly, "before I say yes or no." They exchanged a glance. This time, they didn't argue. That evening, I emailed Judith. She responded the next morning with a draft framework that made me smile. High hourly rate, fixed duration, no responsibility for outcomes, clear boundaries. When I presented it, my father read silently. "This is very formal," he said. "It has to be," I replied. "That's how trust works now." He nodded. We signed. Over the next month, I answered questions from the acquiring firm. I explained systems I'd once maintained alone. I watched strangers understand in weeks what my family had ignored for years. It went there. It didn't sting. It clarified. At work, Nora called me into her office one afternoon. "You've been offered a promotion," she said. "VP of Operations." I blinked. "Already," she smiled. "You think we didn't notice what you built here?" I accepted without hesitation. The announcement went out internally. Congratulatory messages poured in. Not performative, genuine. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from Megan. I heard. Congratulations. Thank you, I replied. A pause. Then, do you ever miss it? The old company? I thought about it. I miss who I was before I understood the cost, I said. Not the place. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, it was simple. I get that now. The sale of the family business closed in early spring. My parents downsized. Luke drifted. Megan stayed on briefly, then left. The legacy dissolved quietly. One evening, my mother called. We should have listened, she said. Yes, I replied. You should have. No anger. No satisfaction. Just truth. As months passed, my life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Work that challenged without consuming me. Relationships that didn't require self-erasure. Silence that felt like rest instead of abandonment. The final moment came unexpectedly. At a conference, I ran into a woman who'd worked at the company years ago. She hugged me warmly. You know, she said, we all assumed you'd inherit the place. I smiled. So did I. Once. She tilted her head. Do you regret not fighting harder? I considered her question carefully. No, I said. I fought in the only way that mattered, by leaving. Because sometimes the most powerful confrontation isn't standing your ground. It's walking away with your dignity intact and letting everything else fall where it may. Success is quieter than people think. There were no victory laps after the promotion. No dramatic announcements. Just longer meetings, heavier decisions, and a different kind of accountability. One that didn't ask me to disappear for the sake of others. I moved into a new office. Same building, different floor. The view wasn't better, but the air felt lighter. On my first day as VP, Nora stopped by. You don't owe anyone proof, she said. Just build what you think should exist. That sentence stayed with me, because for most of my life, everything I built had been a response to need, to pressure, to unspoken expectation. Now it was choice. At home, Daniel noticed the difference. You're not waiting for something to go wrong, he said one night as we cooked dinner. I don't live in anticipation anymore. I replied, I live in intention. He smiled. That suits you. The family adjusted slowly. My father retired fully. My mother found new routines. Megan took a job in another state. Luke remained Luke. We saw each other at holidays. Polite, careful, less entangled. One afternoon, Megan called unexpectedly. I'm thinking of therapy, she said. That's good, I replied. I didn't realize how much of our dynamic was built on not upsetting Mom and Dad. I said nothing. I think you were the pressure valve, she continued. We leaned on you, so we wouldn't have to push back. I closed my eyes briefly. Yes, I said. I'm sorry, she added. I know it doesn't change anything. It changes something, I replied. Just not the past. A few weeks later, Judith emailed to tell me the sale had officially closed. All obligations fulfilled. No loose ends. You're free, she wrote. I sat with that word. Free didn't mean unconnected. It meant uncoerced. The final test came on my mother's birthday. She invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. Over soup and salad. She reached across the table and touched my wrist. I wish I had protected you better, she said. The old part of me would have rushed to comfort her. I didn't. I wish you had too, I replied. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I thought keeping the peace was the same as love. It isn't, I said. It just looks safer. We sat in silence after that. Not awkward, honest. As I drove home, I realized something profound. They weren't villains. They were afraid. Afraid of conflict. Afraid of losing control. Afraid of change. And I had paid the price for that fear for years. But I wasn't angry anymore, because I had learned the most important lesson, too late, to save the relationship as it was, but early enough to save myself. That night, I wrote something in a notebook I'd kept since the beginning of all this. You don't need permission to leave what hurts you. You don't need consensus to choose yourself. You don't need revenge when clarity will do. The final chapter wasn't about them. It was about me, and it was time to say that out loud. The truth is, life didn't suddenly become perfect after everything settled. It became honest. There's a difference. Some mornings, I still woke up with the old instinct to check my phone, bracing for problems that weren't mine anymore. Some holidays still carried the echo of what I used to give and what I no longer offered. Healing didn't arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a series of small choices, repeated until they felt natural. The biggest change was this. I stopped negotiating my worth. At work, I built teams the way I once wished someone had built around me. Clear roles, shared knowledge, no single point of failure. I insisted on documentation not as bureaucracy, but as respect. Respect for time, for limits, for the fact that no one should be indispensable at the cost of their health. When someone stayed late too often, I asked why. When someone took on too much, I intervened. When someone spoke up about a concern, I made sure it was addressed, not buried. People noticed, not in applause, in trust. One afternoon, a junior manager knocked on my door. I turned down a project, she said, nervous. I didn't have the bandwidth to do it well. I smiled. Good, she blinked. That's it, I said. That moment mattered more to me than any title ever had. At home, Daniel and I talked about the future, not in rushed plans or survival timelines, but in possibilities. Travel, stability, a life that didn't require constant sacrifice to earn its place. As for my family, we found a version of peace that didn't require closeness. We talked occasionally, shared updates, avoided old traps. I no longer filled the gaps. And strangely, the structure held better without me doing that work. The final message came quietly on an ordinary Tuesday. An email from my father. No subject line, just a sentence. You were right to leave. I read it once. I didn't reply. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because I didn't need the conversation to continue. Some acknowledgments are meant to be received, not discussed. That evening, I sat on my balcony as the sun went down, city lights flickering on one by one. I thought about the version of myself who had believed love meant endurance, who thought being needed was the same as being valued, who stayed long after the cost became clear because leaving felt like failure. She wasn't weak. She was loyal beyond reason, and she deserved better. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's this. Revenge isn't always loud. It isn't always destructive. It isn't always about making someone else suffer. Sometimes, revenge is walking away without explaining yourself again. Sometimes, it's building a life where your absence doesn't collapse you. Sometimes, it's choosing dignity over approval and never looking back. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe, or share it with someone who might be carrying more than they should. Drop a comment if you've ever been the strong one in your family or workplace, the one everyone leans on but rarely protects. Your story matters, and choosing yourself is not betrayal. It's survival.